If we saw any plant that we thought might be psychoactive, we just ate it. In doing so, we discovered a lot of new hallucinogens. If you take 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, you're not really even taking a hallucinogen because there's no one home anymore. I think Terence famously said it was like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. I once was lost in the forest for 12 days with no food and no way out. It's a collective experience whereby the entire male population for 3 days and 3 nights consumes ayahuasca, and you soar away on the wings of trance to visit the sacred sites where the ancestors worked their magical deeds of rescue. These substances were absolutely, in my mind, catalytic in my life and helped make me the person that I am. People always laugh, Sam. They say to me, "Wait, how have you written 25 books?" I just smile. Because for me, Coca has been very helpful in my life. We have this sort of incredible hypocrisy that has denied access to a plant that's been sacred, revered, Latin America's greatest gift to the world.
You're listening to ayahuascapodcast.com. Hi guys, and welcome to Ayahuasca Podcast. As always, we do the host Sam Believ, and today I'm interviewing Wade Davis. Wade Davis is a world-renowned ethnobotanist, anthropologist, and explorer. A protege of the legendary Richard Evan Schultes, Wade spent over 3 years in the Amazon and Andes, living among 15 indigenous groups and making thousands of botanical collections. He's the author of the international bestseller One River, a definitive account of Amazonian plant exploration, and the cult classic The Serpent and the Rainbow. Currently a professor emeritus at University of British Columbia and a former explorer in residence at National Geographic, Wade has spent his career documenting the ethnosphere and defending the ancient wisdom of the world's indigenous cultures. This episode is sponsored by LaWayra Ayahuasca Retreat. At LaWayra, we combine affordability, accessibility, and authenticity. LaWayra, connect, heal, grow. Guys, I'm looking forward to hosting you. Wade, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Sam, for having me.
Yeah, it's an honor. Two of my most sort of renowned guests I had on the podcast, Gabor Mate and Dennis McKenna, both mentioned you without me asking on the episode. So that's how I knew I absolutely had to have you. And it's an honor and a pleasure. Wade, now you're this renowned figure, and you've done so much in your life, and you're in your 70s. But let's start in the beginning. Let's start with you coming to Colombia as a young man. So talk to us about that and how has that influenced your life?
Yeah, well, Sam, it's one thing. It's a nice question to begin with. You get to the age that I am now, or Dennis, or even Gabor, and you have kind of an obligation to look back and reflect and to the extent possible, share a bit of, I don't know if it's wisdom, but certainly experience with the younger people. And I think one thing that younger people are misled is the idea that life is linear, that you go from A to B. If you skip C and D, you don't get to the rest of the alphabet. And in fact, life is made up of these serendipitous moments when your destiny kind of meets you. And you have to develop, as Joseph Campbell famously said, a sort of inner compass so that you make those decisions and you own those decisions. So in that sense, no decision can be wrong because you make it. And the goal in life, the greatest creative challenge, is to be the architect of your own life, and always in old age, bitterness comes to those who look back on a life of decisions imposed upon them, and contentment comes to those who can look back and say that they owned all their choices. And I think a big part of that is being patient, and giving your destiny time to find you, but also being opportunistic, not in the sense of being a schemer, but to look for opportunities that kind of end up propelling you to places beyond your imaginings. And I think if you kind of dissect any life well lived, You can look back. I'm sure, Sam, in your own young life, I mean, how did you get to Colombia? How did you meet your wife? You know, how did someone from Lithuania end up in the Americas? You know, something
Latvia.
happened. Oh, I'm sorry, Latvia.
Yeah,
Oh, disculpe,
similar.
hombre. Lo siento tanto, pues, hombre. That's a big faux pas. No, I mean, seriously, though, you know, we have our own destinies. We own our own paths. And in my case, it began very accidentally in a way. I had a modest, humble, but deeply determined mother in Canada, and not quite sure why or how. But when I was 13, she told me that Spanish was a language of the future. And she worked all year as a secretary in a public elementary school to raise enough money to allow me to join a group of schoolboys that a Spanish teacher was going to take to Colombia in the summer of 1968. Now, it's difficult to remember how far away Colombia was in 1968 at a time when most Canadians and Americans, let alone Colombians, had never been in an airplane. And I was very fortunate because at 14, I was the youngest of the 6 lads, and most of them by chance were billeted with quite wealthy families and sort of spent the summer in the sweltering streets of Cali, hanging out the Club Campestre, you know, with the La Gente de Bien. And I was really fortunate to be billeted with a more modest family in the mountains above Cali. And for the 12 weeks of the program, I never saw any of the Canadians, and they all succumbed to what, as you know, the Colombians call mamitis, or homesickness. And I felt like I had finally found home. And I think at that very early age, there was something in the Latin spirit, and particularly the Colombian spirit, that just sort of touched me deeply. I not only didn't feel homesick, I really did feel like I had finally found home. And so years later, when I was a young student at Harvard, and by chance I was in a cafe in Harvard Square with my roommate, and we were both students of anthropology and both tired of just sort of reading about indigenous people in books. And there was a National Geographic map of the world on the wall right beside us in this cafe. And my friend David looked at the map and he looked at me, and suddenly he pointed to the high Canadian Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere, and I literally, Sam, watched my left arm. I was only about 18 at that time, 19 maybe, and my arm just lifted and it hit the northwest Amazon of Colombia. Now, had it hit Latvia or had it hit Italy, I might have become a very different person, right? But it hit Colombia, and having decided on the whim to go to Colombia, however that would happen, there was only one man to see. The professor you mentioned in your introduction, Richard Evans Schultes, who Prince Philip had called the father of the Amazon. Parts of national parks would be named for him. He was a man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the so-called magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. And I just went up to his 4th floor office in the Botanical Museum at Harvard, and I knocked on the door, and I said, I'm from British Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp, and I want to go to the Amazon like you did and collect plants. Now, he had slipped away in 1941 to the Northwest Amazon, and because of the wartime emergency, he was there for 13 uninterrupted years, with the occasional trip back home to Boston to see his family, but basically in the forest for 13 years. And instead of asking me for my credentials, this man who was himself a legend simply looked across a mound of plant specimens and said, well, son, when do you want to go? And 2 weeks later, I landed in El Dorado Airport in Bogota. And just before going, to placate my terrified mother in Victoria, British Columbia, I went back to the professor at her request to get some final tips. And he had 3 vital pieces of information. He said, don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck. And then he said, don't forget to wear a pith helmet because in 13 years he never lost his bifocals. And his third part of advice was to not come home without trying ayahuasca. I didn't use a pith helmet, but I certainly did try ayahuasca. Now, one thing, Sam, that's interesting in the spirit of your work, both at the retreat center and just your interest in this fascinating preparation, ayahuasca, it's amazing to remember that in 1974, which this now was, in the wake of the entire psychedelic era of the 1960s, ayahuasca at that time was so obscure that if I had told 100 people who had experienced, for example, LSD or mescaline, that I was about to take ayahuasca, I promise you 95, if not 99 out of 100 would not even know what ayahuasca was. That's how obscure it was in the early 1970s. And yet Schultes himself, inspired by his great hero, Richard Spruce, in the 1850s, had written about Yahé in the Colombian Amazon and in adjacent parts of the Rio Negro in Brazil. Schultes was the one who in the 1940s and early 50s really began to put together the phytochemistry and the pharmacology and the incredible sophistication of these folk preparations and the great mystery, of course, of the activation of the tryptamines by the beta-carbolines.
Yeah, so you touched so many interesting topics there, but I want to start with saying that, these days we don't have tribal societies, but we do still have our modern day elders on the internet. I consider you one of them. And as you said, Schultes had his own inspirations, Bruce, and now he inspired you and you inspire me. And hopefully when I'm 70, I can inspire somebody else in return. So it's this beautiful progression of how the information travels. And Schultes told you don't go back home without trying ayahuasca. However, in his reports, when he was asked about ayahuasca, he was very superficial. He would just say, "No, I just saw colors," or he didn't really go in detail. You knowing him in person, do you think he did go deep with the plants and inspired him in some way, or do you think that he didn't?
It's a very, very good question, Sam, because it really touches on something that we've always spoken about, and certainly was people like Tim Leary and Richard Albert, but then Andrew Weil, an acolyte of Schultes as well, kind of a big brother of mine, always spoke about, which is set and setting. And this, of course, is so important, which is the setting being the physical space in which you experience these powerful substances, and set being the mental landscape of your imagination that you bring to the experience. And so for us to try to understand what taking these substances meant to Schultes, not just ayahuasca or Yahé in Colombia, a slightly different preparation, but with the same fundamental use of Beniceriopsis caapi, but to go back to his use of mushrooms, or his experimentation with mushrooms, because he didn't actually use the mushrooms in Oaxaca, which is itself interesting. But to his use of peyote, which is where it really all began. You have to remember that these guys, and this is what makes that generation so fascinating. And I was, as you mentioned, very fortunate to know not just Schultes, but because of his circle of compadres. I knew Albert Hoffman, I knew Gordon Wasson, I knew Richard Albert, and we have to remember that these people were experimenting with these substances almost in a complete void. You had the writings of Aldous Huxley happening there. You had the earlier works of Louis Levin, but he was very, very racist and very judgmental, and his work was sort of important but clinical in a way. And so when, for example, it all began for Schultes in a really remarkable way. He was a young student from East Boston, so poor that the family couldn't afford to pay for the dormitories. So he would commute to Harvard. He was the first of his family to go to college. And he had to take a job, and he took a job filing cards in the most eclectic library probably in North America at the time, which was the Economic Botany Library of the Botanical Museum. And between these folios of ancient plants and monographs of distant tribes, he kind of fell away into trance, became enchanted. And he took the course that had been taught at Harvard longer than any other course. It was then called Biology 16, Plants and Human Affairs. And that's a course that I would take, that my friend Mark Plotkin would take, that Mike Balick would take, that Andrew Weil would get turned on to, that Tim Plowman would teach, you know. So that was an extraordinary course at the university. And they had to do, during the entire extent of Prohibition, their professor, who hated the federal government, insisted that they have a lab experiment whereby they distilled and fermented alcohol and then drank huge amounts of it as the laboratory experiment during Prohibition. But when it came time to examine these curious plants that Lewin had called the Fantastica, their professor had his own limitations, so the students had to do a book report, and Schultes had so much homework that he raced to the back of the lab to get the thinnest possible book he could get. And he put into his satchel, and he returned that evening to his tenement in East Boston. And that night, botanical history was made, because the thin book that he had happened to grab off the shelf was written by Henrik Kluver, and it was the only book then available in the English language that described the stunning pharmacological effects of peyote and mescaline. And Schultes, as a young boy, read through the night of visions of orb-like brilliance that swept over the imagination of anyone who consumed the sacred plant. And he went back to his professor the next day and he said, I have to know this plant. And so his professor gave him a reading list and then arranged for him to have a small scholarship. And that summer, in a 1928 Studebaker car, he and a young anthropology graduate student, Weston LaBarre, who would go on to write the seminal book, The Peyote Cult, bounced and rumbled over the dusty roads of America at Oklahoma Territory to live among the roadmen of the Kiowa and ingest peyote 3 and 4 nights a week for 8 weeks of his young life. And Schultes came back a man transformed. But that's where we first hear him saying, I only got colors. And LaBarre, who was a Freudian anthropologist, if you will, was always perplexed by that. And I asked Weston, when I interviewed him for the book One River, just before he died, what it meant when Schultes said, I only got colors. And what Weston said is that Schultes was so shuttered within the constraints of his own worldview. And you see these images in Oklahoma. He was dazzled by what he saw all around him, but was he able really to let himself free? He publicly, he would say, I only just got colors. But Sam, when I wrote that chapter in the book One River, which I think we call the Peyote Road, and I took a first, it was a first, you know, to write that book, I had to recreate Schultes' life. He didn't keep journals. I had every single fact there had to be retrieved from some primary, secondary, or tertiary source. And I took a certain amount of license to try to bring alive what his experiences were. So, for example, I went to accounts of, I had taken peyote myself. I had read accounts of the Kiowa. I knew his informants, Charlie Charcoal. And in the book, in a kind of work of literary nonfiction, I imagined a peyote ceremony, right? I knew the ceremony had happened, but I brought it alive in dialogue, and all that dialogue I had found somewhere, right? But the amazing thing is when Schultes read the book One River, and I was quite nervous about how this kind of formal, a very academic Harvard professor would respond to that literary kind of poetic license in a way, you know. But what was extraordinary is his wife said that he kept the book by his bedside table until he died. And when he couldn't sleep, he'd just open it up and read of his life. And I mean, it was quite amusing. At one point, he said to me, "You won't believe what Mrs. Bedard said to me when I met her in Bogota in 1943." And then he pointed to some dialogue that I had made up because the book had become his reality. You know, he had made my life possible, and my final gift to him was giving back to him a life that he had forgotten. But the interesting thing in terms of your question is if you read the passages that I essentially, it wasn't fiction, but it was my imagining his imagination, if you will. It's quite florid, and it drew on my own ecstatic experiences with mescaline, right, and peyote. And yet, when Schultes read those quite almost wild passages, he came up to me and he said, "I don't believe it. It was like you were inside my head. That's just what I saw. That's just what I saw." In other words, when he says, "I only got colors," I think that was his way publicly. Remember what he was doing. Two things. First of all, he was exploring these plants at a time when that exploration could almost be seen as a form of madness. Then he was dealing with the pop culture of psychedelics, which threatened to overwhelm his work. Remember when Leary stumbled upon hallucinogens because of the Life magazine cover story of Wasson using the mushrooms in Oaxaca in 1953, and Wasson was directed to Oaxaca, to Huautla, to the Mazatec, to Maria Sabina by Schultes, who had been there in the 1930s. And so he was, he famously disowned Leary for using the word psychedelic when the proper Greek was psychodelic. But he was really distancing himself from the pop culture of psychedelics because, remember, this was a major force of his academic interests, and the government was coming down very, very hard on this, right? The other thing is that this was a man who lived alone with indigenous people for months and months and months at a time. We go off and do field work. It's like when you go down to Leticia to hang out with the Tucuna, or maybe go to Mitu and hang out with the Barasana, the Cubeo, or the Macuna, the Tanimucos, for a few weeks, and it's cool, and we all have a chance to do that now. But this is at a time when, when he entered the Amazon, it was a kind of one-way street, right? And, in the same way that you often hear of British explorers who, in the middle of nowhere, would insist on shaving themselves clean every day, it's a way of kind of keeping civilization intact around you so you don't just explode all over the place. And I think this is what was going on with Schultes when he said, "I only just saw colors." I had spent a lot of time with Paul Bowles in Morocco once, and he was a man famously constrained, although his imagination was just so wild as a writer and as a human being. But Bertolucci, the great Italian film director, told me that Paul had to be like that because if he wasn't like that, if he didn't have that, literally the physical coat and tie that he wore in Tangier in the Moroccan heat, he would just explode all over the place. So there was this element in Schultes of, and I remember that, I once was lost in the forest for 12 days with no food and no way out. I remember kind of reflexively slashing at the vegetation with my machete for no particular purpose, but somehow to make a statement that I was going to survive, and I think that's what that "I only saw colors" thing. He had to keep control because, remember, another thing, the thing about it is by the time all of us were taking psychedelics, we knew about psychedelics. We had been told about psychedelics. I mean, by the time you came to ayahuasca, there were thousands of people around you who had taken it, But these individuals were real pioneers, and there were no reference points. And I think they had to find ways to protect themselves, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Talking about Schultes and his explorations A lot of people now, when they talk about ayahuasca, they always think about Peru or Costa Rica, which is makes no sense, but that's just how culture has evolved. And very few people know that Schultes actually was doing his research on ayahuasca in Colombia. So, do
Well,
you?
it's not just, the key thing there is it's not ayahuasca in Colombia.
Yeah.
It's Yahé, and it's a very different preparation. It's a decoction and different admixtures. I mean, one of um, um, uh, the great mysteries that Schultes struggled with was the fact that tryptamines, which are the active constituents in ayahuasca and in Yahé, are orally inactive. That's why the Yanomami, for example, use a benet, the semen of the sun, derived from the blood red resin of various species in the Virola genus, a genus of trees in the nutmeg family. They make those powders and blow them up the nose, right? Or you can smoke DMT, but you can't take it orally because it's naturally denatured by an enzyme found in the human stomach, monoamine oxidase. And the great mystery of ayahuasca was how were these tryptamines being activated? And of course, the great discovery was that the beta carbolines, compounds found within the actual woody liana, Banisteriopsis capi, were MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines. And that was something that Schultes unraveled. And curiously, the admixture plant in that contains the tryptamines there are various sources, but of course the famous one is chacruna, which is Psychotria viridis, which is in the coffee family. But there's also chagropanga, which is another species in the Malpighiaceae, Diploteris risbiana. And but curiously, the very first specimen of the admixture ever collected wasn't collected by Schultes. It was collected by William Burroughs, who knew nothing about botany but was hanging out with Schultes in 1952 in the Colombian Amazon, in the Putumayo.
So, how do you think we went from them doing it in Colombia to now very few people knowing that ayahuasca or Yahé even exists in Colombia? Because I understand the difference, right? The different DMT shrub and tryptamine source, but the vine is the same. And now Colombia was kind of completely overlooked by the psychedelic tourism, and there's very
well.
good,
Thank God. I would just say thank God for that.
There's good things that came from it, but
I
what do you think happened then?
what's really fascinating, Sam, is if you had, I first took ayahuasca in 1974, and we talk about set and setting. I remember Tim Plowman saying to me, Yahé is many things, but pleasant isn't one of them. And when William Burroughs, the original popularization of Yahé was in Colombia, and it really was from a series of letters exchanged between Allen Ginsberg, the poet, and William Burroughs, the writer. And Burroughs went down to Colombia in I think it was 51, looking for the ultimate mind-bending high. And that precipitated a series of exchanges as they went back and forth between Ginsberg and Burroughs, with Ginsberg also going down. And that was published by City Lights Books in San Francisco as the Yahé Letters. And in the Yahé Letters, you have this very funny scene where Burroughs, who at the time was a heroin user, writing books like Junk and was his other famous one, Naked Lunch, but he and Schultes had gone to Harvard at the same time, and he goes down to Bogota, and there's a scene where he goes to the National Herbarium. He's looking for Yahé, which he thinks is going to be the ultimate mind-bending high, and he runs into this professor from Boston who he calls Doc Schindler. Well, that was Schultes, and Schultes sends him off to Macoa to get Yahé, and Burroughs gets beaten up by the cops, robbed by a thief, rolled by a pimp, and basically, escapes tail between his legs and scrambles back to Bogota. And he writes Ginsberg, and I said, I'm going to give it one more try, Alan, but this time I'm going to stick close to Doc Schindler. And so Schultes, being Schindler, and Burroughs go back to Mocoa, and Schultes scores him a big whack of Yahé. He takes it with the shaman, becomes convinced that the shaman's life is dedicated to killing gringos, has a total panic attack, pops a bunch of downers, and runs away. And, I love that story because it suggests that, this veteran of 1,000 strange scenes just couldn't handle the psychic onslaught of Yahé. And, it's interesting. I remember in that era, Tim and I were traveling for 15 months together on that one trip. And as Schultes said, we ate our way through South America. If we saw any plant that we thought might be psychoactive, we just ate it, and in doing so, we discovered a lot of new hallucinogens. A couple times damn near got poisoned. But my point is that none of us particularly liked or Yahé. A very good friend of mine just passed away, Bobby Weir of the Grateful Dead. And Bobby always, bless him, we always joked about that because, here's a member of the Grateful Dead and he couldn't stand Yahé when he took it. And one of the things that's been so interesting in terms of set and setting is how your generation has come along for whatever reason and kind of developed a totally different zeitgeist about ayahuasca. Now, I've taken ayahuasca or Yahé, I would think 20 times, but almost always within real deep ritual context in the Northwest Amazon. In other words, part of the whole retreat center ayahuasca tourism thing is so contrary to the way that indigenous people use the plant. The whole idea of taking the substance as a personal journey or in search of personal curation or to resolve, that certainly did happen, but it was very much a mestizo thing. So, for example, because of the book, The Yahé Letters, which was centered on Mocoa, there was already along the road between Sibundoy and Mocoa, which for those who don't know Colombia was at one point called the Road to Death. It's a precipitous road across the Andes in southern Colombia, and from the Alto Putumayo, a river that's born in the Colombian, El Macizo Colombiano, that gives birth to all the great rivers of Colombia, many of them, but it flows into the Amazon. And in 1974, there were curanderos, very much mestizo, with a kind of syncretic use of the plant, very much in the same sense that San Pedro or Huachuma is used around Huancabamba in Peru, very much a Catholic pre-Columbian synergy, if you will. And in those settings, individuals go to the curandero with individual problems, marital problems, financial problems, spiritual problems, health problems, and they are treated individually in a kind of a classic purgative, not just in terms of taking Yahé, but also with the incantations and the urticating nettle fans that sweep away negativity and all of that focused on the individual. But that is really not the way that Yahé was used aboriginally by indigenous people. On the contrary, if you go, as I've done many times with the Barazana Macuna, you take Yahé and it's a collective experience whereby the entire male population for 3 days and 3 nights consumes consistently and continually ayahuasca, or Yahé in that case, and you go on a collective journey, becoming not symbols of the ancestors, but becoming literally the ancestors. And all the regalia, the feather regalia, of which there's 2 kind of sets, nocturnal and diurnal, or daytime, become not symbols of the sun or symbols of the wild. They are the wild. They are the sun. And you soar away on the wings of trance to visit the sacred sites where the ancestors worked their magical deeds of rescue. And you reaffirm collectively both your obligations and responsibilities and your ownership of territory. And it's the same thing with the kofan. I mean, you go out into the forest, you build a hut. A man, even, not only are women not allowed to be present in the case of the kofan, if a woman is menstruating, her husband's not allowed to be present in the ceremony. And as a group of men, you do this journey. And so the kind of the development of ayahuasca tourism focused on self is a very syncretic and, in a sense, very modern thing. And, it grew up in Peru, I think, in good measure because of access. It grew up around Pucallpa, not just Iquitos, but Pucallpa. And so, for example, when I first went to Iquitos in 1975, there was absolutely no ayahuasca tourism whatsoever. You could find, opportunities to take the preparation, but they're obscure, and you needed to know who to know and have some contact with the massive polyglot of indigenous people that coalesced around both those towns. Whereas in 1975, to get to, for example, Me Too, you had to cross the Andes, often if in an open truck, get to Vial and get yourself on board a military or a cargo DC-3, often without doors and sometimes, with motors catching on fire, which happened to me a couple times, to fly into 3 hours to Me Too. And even once you're in Me Too, to get, for example, to the Pita Paraná, you either had to find a missionary with a small plane to land on an abandoned airstrip, or you had to go overland by water, by canoe, upriver and then downriver to reach and a portage. So I think part of it was ease of access in Peru, and in those early years of the sort of gringo trail, if you will, the vast majority of Europeans and North Americans who were going to South America in search of adventure were not actually that adventuresome, and they mostly just sort of drifted down the Pan American Highway. Roads could take you to Pucallpa, and already Iquitos, though nothing like the city it's become in size, but already it was a major Peruvian presence in the Northwest Amazon, and because of that, for military reasons alone, there were plenty and daily and multiple flights into Iquitos from Lima. So it was very easy to get to. So I think that's part of the explanation.
I always thought it had something to do with the violence in Colombia and then the narcos. And when I first came to Colombia, I was already living here for a few years, and I was already curious about ayahuasca, but maybe because of the different name, I never really thought it was a thing here until I found out, and then I engaged with ayahuasca here, or Yahé. And now it's kind of one of my unofficial missions to restore the justice and to inform the world that ayahuasca does exist in Colombia. But there was definitely a very positive effect for Colombia being overlooked for the psychedelic tourism, because it didn't get out of the control like it did in Peru. Like here in Colombia.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, I was in Medellin in 1974, living there, and the cartels were only just emerging. I mean, Carlos Lida was right up the road from us in Rio Negro, in Guarne, and I always hated cocaine. But I do remember that on our farm, periodically, people would just turn up out of nowhere with briefcases full of cocaine. I fortunately never really indulged, because I just thought it was a horrible drug, much as I love and revere coca leaves. But you're right. I mean, by the late 1980s, Colombia was really off limits to travelers in any kind of serious way. But that's also a kind of interesting metaphor for Colombia, because by the same token, the 50 years of conflict also implied that vast parts of Colombia were left alone from industrial development. I mean, if you compare, for example, in the 1960s, somewhere in eastern Ecuador, the homeland of the Cofan, for example, alrededor de Lago Agrio. Lago Agrio, when I first was there, you can't believe it, Sam, in 1974, it was just a row of shacks on two sides of a dirt road, and now it's a city of God knows how many hundreds of thousands of people. And since the 1970s, the Oriente of Ecuador has been ravaged by colonization, deforestation, oil fields, and pipelines, and so on. And yet today, even though the Colombian Amazon is under threat, it remains a roadless expanse of forest the size of France. And so this was one of the peace dividends, if you will. I think, your work in reclaiming a stolen legacy, in a sense, with Yahé, is echoed in our efforts to liberate Coca from the shadow of cocaine, and bring this extraordinarily beneficial plant to all people in the world. If we could liberate Coca, a plant that's highly nutritious, all kinds of medicinal applications, but more importantly, a plant that works, a mild stimulant, and actually, helps people. It enhances your focus, your concentration in the most subtle of ways. It gives you a slight lift to your spirits. It could, I think, displace all these horrible drugs like Ritalin and Adderall and serotonin uptake inhibitors, Prozac, and bring its untold benefits to the well-being of all of humanity.
I have a mamba in my cheek. I'm a big fan of...
hombre. Ese no fue justo. ¿No?
You don't like mamba?
No, me encanta mamba, pero estoy aquí en Canadá. Por eso yo soy geloso. No, but also, we have 250,000 families, campesino families in Colombia, who have to grow coca to survive. We could give them a licit market. We could give through tax revenue the nation state of Colombia the revenues to pay the cost of peace. I mean, it's just waiting there to be plucked out. No plant that is out there could bring greater benefits to a greater number of people in all corners of the world. And that's sort of my mission in life, is to liberate coca in that sense.
Before I even read your book, Magdalena, about Colombia and the river and coca, I've already been saying this for a few years. My second unofficial mission is to rebrand Colombia from cocaine to ayahuasca, or from sort of bad drugs to good drugs. And I'm a big fan of coca as a plant in its traditional use, because it is this amazing, very mild stimulant.
Sam, I wrote a long piece for Rolling Stone earlier this year. The most remarkable story about coca, which people don't know about, is that the efforts to eradicate the traditional fields began fully 60 years before there was a cocaine problem. And let's remember the adage, there's no such thing as good and bad drugs. There's good and bad ways of using drugs. I mean, cocaine hydrochloride extracted from coca leaves remains our most important topical anesthetic for nose, throat, and ear surgery. So it's not that cocaine is bad per se, it's how people use it and the criminalization around its use that causes such agonies. But the fascinating thing is that the early attempts to eradicate the fields had nothing to do with cocaine, nothing to do with the pharmacology of coca chewing, everything to do with the cultural identity of those who revered the plants. And it began with physicians in Lima, health officials, who looked up into the Andes and saw illiteracy, poverty, social pathologies of one sort or another, and had to settle on a cause in their good intentions. And because issues of land distribution, economic disparity, exploitation came too close to challenging the bourgeois foundations of their lives in Lima, they settled on coca, and they made coca the source of all problems in the Andes. And remember, this was at a time in the 1920s and 30s where Andean South America, much of Latin America indeed in total, very much remained a place of conqueror and conquered. the gap between the European descent, the European descent and the indigenous people was a chasm. And so if you look at the language of these pseudoscientific reports, it oozes contempt for the culture of the Andean people. It is deeply racist. It is almost revoltingly racist. And when at the invitation of both Peru and Peru and Bolivia initially, the UN sent a commission to study the so-called Coca problem. It was led by a CEO from the pharmaceutical company called Wellcome Burroughs, a man called Fonda, and he announced his conclusions before leaving New York. And then he announced his conclusions again upon arrival at the airport in Lima. And in 3 months of studying the so-called Coca problem, traveling all through southern Andes of Bolivia and Peru, they never once spoke to someone from a traditional culture who used the plant. And naturally, their report called for the elimination of the plant. And that point of view has continued to this day. And I wrote an essay that reveals the language that these people used, and that also explains why in all those 60 years, all these public health officials never bothered to do a nutritional study of the plant, even though it was used every day by millions of their citizens. And the explanation for that is very simple. They didn't want to know that the plant could have benefits. And when we finally did the first nutritional study of Coca, Tim Plowman, in 1975, what he discovered horrified the DEA, because it turns out that Coca has a tiny amount of cocaine, and it's a precursor to the salt, cocaine hydrochloride, a very different compound. But more importantly, the plant is full of nutrients, full of vitamins, has more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, making it perfect for a diet in the Andes that traditionally lacked a dairy product. And it even had enzymes which enhance the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect for the carbohydrate potato-based diet of the Andes. So in one assay that could have been done in the 1920s, Tim put into stark profile these horrible efforts to eliminate the traditional fields and showed that this was a plant that had been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for 8,000 years. And so what we need to be focused on is that the demonization of the plant came out of a place of individuals, and not just public health officials in Lima, but their views were parroted by similar bourgeois authorities in Colombia and Bolivia, and it came out of a place of absolute revolting racism and contempt, right? It's almost as if we were living, I mean, it's not too harsh to say, or hyperbolic to say, it'd be the equivalent to discover that we are still governing ourselves by laws and opinions generated by Nazi Germany, And yet, recently, the World Health Organization, at the request of Bolivia and Colombia, did a formal review of Coca to see whether it should be rescheduled or descheduled. Because at the moment, Coca leaves, despite their extraordinary history of benign use and beneficial use, are considered by World Health Organization to be the equivalent of fentanyl or heroin. And the review process called for submissions from academic bodies, and yet Andy Weil and I, who were part of a submission from University of Arizona, were disqualified by the WHO because we were seen to be advocates of the leaf. So in other words, if you're doing a review of this plant that's been misunderstood, and you have people who understand that history and are advocates of the plant, they are excluded from the process because they bring their positive opinions to that process. And not surprising, the determination of the WHO, despite all the protestations at the highest levels of the Colombian government, they concluded recently that this had to remain classified as the equivalent of fentanyl. And there were even completely dishonest reports in that document of purported mortality, people dying by using coca leaves, which is about as ridiculous as saying somebody died from drinking a tinto, you know?
Yeah, I'm sure much more people die from eating standard American diet, which is now changing than coca leaves. And if you really look into, like I traveled to San Agustin in Colombia, there's those ancient statues made of stone, and all of the figures have one cheek protruding because.
No, I mean, but you know, one of the really interesting things that people don't know, Sam, about coca, it's fascinating. You know, when Tim and I were doing the original research on coca, we knew there were two cultivated species, very different. Erythroxylon novagranatense, which is the classic coca of Colombia, used by the Nasa and Cauca, used by the Mamos of the Arahuaco, the Wiwa, Cancuano, and Cogi in the Sierra Nevada. And this would have been the plant that in pre-Columbian times was used in Costa Rica. And we also knew there was, of course, Erythroxylon coca, the classic coca of the southern Andes. And each of these had two varieties. The Colombian coca had come down the coast of Ecuador and down into Peru, and in the desert habitat around Trujillo had been a variety had been developed which Tim called Trujillense, but it was Colombian coca in northern Peru. And the Amazonian coca of Colombia was morphologically much similar to Peruvian coca of the Andes than it was to Colombian coca. And so Tim postulated that the Amazonian coca, which was planted vegetatively, which is a source of mambe, or ipadu, had in pre-Columbian times come down the river from Peru and then been developed in northwest Amazon. And all of that was based on morphological analysis. And Colombian coca is able to self-pollinate. In other words, a single shrub can pollinate itself, right? And that self-pollination is good for the bush, but not good for the species. So a plant's ability, if a plant can self-pollinate in botany, it's considered a derived trait, which suggested to Tim that Colombian coca was developed from Peruvian coca, okay? But that was all before DNA. And a wonderful botanist, Dawson White, who's sort of taken over Tim's mantle, using DNA analysis has revealed a miracle. And that is the fact that in the domesticated coca that we see today used in South America actually was domesticated not once, not twice, but 3 times. And so that the coca of Colombia was independently developed from the same ancestor, as was the coca of the Colombian Amazon, as was Peruvian coca, and that ancestor has been identified as a wild species of coca called Erythroxylon gracilipes, which grows along the entire Ceja de la Montaña, the eastern flank of the Andes, from northern Colombia all the way to Bolivia. Now, this may sound like kind of arcane botanical science, but it's incredibly significant. In the entire history of plant domestication, there's almost very, very few examples of a major cultigen being domesticated more than once from the same wild ancestor. And in this case, not once but 3 times, thousands of kilometers apart. But even more extraordinary is that across that entire range from Costa Rica to northern Chile, the plant was always deemed to be sacred. So it means that at 3 different points in prehistory, human beings came upon this humble beautiful shrub with fruits like rubies growing in the forest, and somehow said, I think this one's got something. I think this one's got something. And they invested hundreds of hours of effort over hundreds of years to domesticate that wild plant and bring it into the human toolkit. And they did it 3 different times. And why did they do it? Was it just because it had some medicinal aspects? Did they do it because it had nutrition? Well, yes, we can say that Coca is nutritious, but the way that Coca is used outside of Northwest Amazon, where the leaves are actually masticated, not consumed, so you don't consume most of the nutrition. So the point of Tim's nutritional study wasn't really to say that Coca is a major component of diet. It was to demonstrate that the plant was not toxic and incidentally show that it was in fact full of nutrients. But no one was ever arguing that Coca was a major aspect of diet. So it wasn't diet. It wasn't medicine. What was it? It was the fact that Coca improves lives, that Coca is so subtle, and yet it allows us to overcome so many subtle things that afflict us. You know, we know that the kinds of little afflictions, whether it's neuroses or whether it's depression or whether it's just aggravation or whatever, all of these little afflictions are part of the price we pay for being conscious.
This episode is sponsored by LaWayra Ayahuasca Retreat. Most of you know LaWayra if you've been listening to this podcast for a while. Some of you might have already been to LaWayra before. For those who don't know us yet, we started LaWayra 4 years ago. At LaWayra, we combine authenticity, accessibility, and affordability. LaWayra is currently highest rated ayahuasca retreat in South America with more than 700 5-star reviews and an average rating of 5 stars. If you come to LaWayra, you'll experience powerful, authentic ceremonies led by our indigenous shaman, Fernando, in a very beautiful venue just 1 hour south of Medellin, Colombia. We're surrounded by nature and have comforts like hot water, Wi-Fi. At LaWayra, our team has guided more than 2,500 people through this life-changing transformation of ayahuasca experience. At the same time, we keep it very affordable. So whether you're coming for healing, clarity, or a deeper connection to yourself, LaWayra is the best choice. If it is your first time drinking ayahuasca, you will love our 3.5-hour preparation course and integration support. All of that is included in price, as well as pickup from Medellin, accommodation, and ayahuasca. Visit lawayra.com to book your retreat or learn more. LaWayra, connect, heal, grow. LAWAYRA.com.
And there's no reason to believe that our ancient ancestors were free of these afflictions. If they were conscious, we know they weren't. And what Coca does is eliminate those afflictions in a subtle way. The most interesting research on Coca, Sam, was done in the late 19th century by physicians, some Latino, some European, some American, who knew about the dangers of cocaine, but had no bias against the leaves. And I'm talking about people like Mortimer and Lloyd and Christensen, the head of the British Medical Association. And these men, you read their reports, and they're so ingenuous. They're saying, you know, I think this is supposed to be a stimulant, but you don't really know you're stimulated, but then it is a stimulant. I mean, it's so sweet, their reports. And what they're describing is the most remarkable feature of coca leaves, which is that the effects are so subtle that you only notice the effects by the consequences the effects have on your mood and your daily life. You start off the day and suddenly discover that you're focusing on your work far more than before, that you can concentrate, that you have a slight creative lift that overcomes inertia, a slight leveling of mood so you're not distracted by some silly worry. You're not getting up to get another cup of coffee that just leaves you jittery like this, right? And at the end of the day, you've accomplished so much, and then you simply go for a walk or you go home for dinner, sleep comfortably, have no effects whatsoever save the productivity of the day, And then you could do it all again the next day. And that if you run out of leaves, nothing happens. You just think, oh, it's too bad I don't have that little helper, but I'll keep at my work. And, people always laugh, Sam. They say to me, Wade, how have you written 25 books, or made 40 films? And Sam, I just smile. Because, because Coca has been for me, Coca has been very, very helpful in my life. And I think that this is the real crime, is that a completely benign plant that has all these demonstrated benefits, concrete benefits, as opposed to the plethora of phony ingredients that people pay thousands of dollars for in the health care business. In contrast to all the other vegetable stimulants that we somehow tolerate, from mate to coffee to tea. It's interesting. I had this experience with the World Cup, where the captain of the Peruvian side, who played for a Brazilian team in Sao Paulo, tested positive for metabolite of cocaine. And he was going to be thrown off the team the very year that Peru qualified for the World Cup for the first time in a decade. And his lawyer called me from Sao Paulo, and I said, he's from Lima, right? And we just had Christmas, and I bet he went to Ayacucho or Cusco. Oh yeah, he did. And I said, he stayed at the Monasterio Hotel. Oh yeah, he did. And he drank Coca tea, didn't he? Oh yeah, he drank it. And we were able to get him off the hook because he had the metabolite, because he had drunk mate de coca, which is about as toxic as chamomile. And yet, if you look at the World Cup, the Argentinian side brought to Doha 1,100 pounds of mate. The Uruguayan team brought 900 pounds of mate only because they didn't anticipate making it that far into the tournament, right? Mm-hmm. But if the Peruvians had taken Coca, what would have happened to them? They'd be jailed. And if they had been allowed to play with Coca, who knows what would have happened? There's a wonderful story from 1877, the International Lacrosse Championship in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. Two sides, one made up of lumberjacks from the forests of northern Ontario, big, huge men, super strong, right? And the other side, all these clerks from the city streets of Toronto. The lumberjacks should have murdered the clerks, but it was a hot, hot day in Toronto, very humid. And guess who won? The clerks. The clerks won because they were using Coca. Right? And so the point is that we have this sort of incredible hypocrisy that has denied access to a plant that's been sacred, revered, Latin America's greatest gift to the world. And the denigration and the demonization of Coca is nothing less than a supreme insult to all of Latin America. And that meanwhile, we keep pouring into our children Ritalin, Adderall, Prozac, on all these powerful pharmaceutical agents when we have a natural product proven to be benign, which could displace all of those powerful drugs to the well-being of all.
Not even saying about the spiritual use, because obviously it has some effect, and they say it sweetens your tongue. Like when you speak, you sound more nicer and you're better to each other. And obviously it's a superfood and takes away the hunger. It could probably help people lose weight as well. But what do you think about this notion?
Sam, one thing that's really important to say there is that to deny the Andean people Coca is not the same as denying beer to the Germans or tea to the British, coffee to the French and Turks, or betel nut to the Indonesians. The use of Coca defines your presence and your identity as a runakuna. You cannot be of that culture if you do not use Coca and use it properly. Nothing offends Andean people more than gringos who stuff their mouths with coca leaves like horses eating hay. The ritual use of the plant, the salutation to the apus, the ritual exchange of a cruceta of 3 leaves to people you meet on the trail, having distance measured not in kilometers but in coca quids. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So it really, to deny the Andean people Coca, just imagine denying the Mamos of the Sierra Nevada, Hayo. It would be an act of cultural genocide, and that's indeed what it is.
Yeah. Okay, let's switch topics a little bit. Let's go back in the past and let's talk about your explorations, right? Because you went on so many trips around Amazon, and can you tell us about your trip to Amazon with the McKenna brothers? Because they're also legendary.
I mean, I just say for the sake of the audience, I was very fortunate. I studied botany because of Schultes, but I was always more of an anthropologist. And I was fortunate to become and recruited to the National Geographic as their anthropologist in 1999 with the explicit mission of changing the way the world views and values culture in a decade. And so with that came an opportunity to travel even more than I had traveled before. I was on the road 6 months of the year at least, sometimes traveling to 100 countries or more, or at least 50 countries in a year, celebrating the wonder of the ethnosphere. And the fundamental thrust of our program was to suggest to people that there was no hierarchy when it came to culture. Every culture has something to say. Each one deserved to be heard. Every culture was just a unique answer to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity. And the reason that it was of such urgency was that those voices were being silenced. And when I was hired by the Geographic, of the 7,000 languages spoken in the world today, half weren't being taught to school children, which meant that half of humanity's collective knowledge was at risk. And the reason this was so tragic is it was happening at a time when genetics was showing the indisputable fact that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all children of Africa. We're all ultimately brothers and sisters. The genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is an utter fiction. The idea of a hierarchy of culture going from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized at the Strand of London was a pure 19th century conceit. Every culture had the same genius, and how they chose to use that genius was simply a matter of choice and cultural adaptation. So every culture had something to say. So that my mission was to demonstrate that show, don't tell. So I sailed with the Polynesian wayfinders. I would go to the Arctic and look at the grace of survival in the ice. We'd make films about the Buddhist science of the mind, the wonder of Udun in West Africa, Dreamtime and the songlines in Australia, the Mamos and notions of sacred geography in Colombia and Peru. And I was able to, over the course of 15 years, in a life that had already experienced a lot of travel, really go wherever my intuitions took me, where I could best tell that story. But going back to the story of the McKenna brothers, that's sort of an amusing one. Terence McKenna is one of the most remarkable characters I've ever met. He had an absolute Irish gift for the gab. And his brother Dennis, who is still alive, is a very, very close friend of mine. And Dennis was actually in many ways the more interesting of the two brothers, because Dennis was a serious scientist, a serious phytochemist, who also had his mind perfectly capable of expansion. And I remember I first heard about the brothers from Tim Plowman in 1974, because they were about to publish their book, The Mind, Hallucinogens, and the I Ching, which was the results of their famous experiment at La Chorrera, where Dennis basically took Yahé for I can't remember how many days in a row to see what would happen. And by the time I actually met them, I met them in Iquitos in 1981 or so, 82 maybe. And I had been asked to help out a group called the Institute of Ecotechnics, who had brought a concrete junk ship up the Amazon to do ethnobotanical research. And both the McKenna brothers and I kind of turned up at the dock in Iquitos. And Dennis was studying orally active tryptamines. Schultes had reported that the Bora and the Huitoto had oral preparations based on Varrola. And that was really interesting to Dennis because they weren't, of course, as you know, supposed to be orally active. And the Bora and Huitoto had originally lived in and around La Chorrera, Caraparana, North Bank affluence of the Putumayo in Colombia. But during the horrors of the rubber era and the Casa Arana, they had been pushed south and into Peru, and they lived at the headwaters of a river called the Rio Ampiacu, which comes into the Amazon at Pelas in Peru, and Ampiacu means the river of poisons. And so we all poured up this river, this kind of crazy entourage of ours, and we would then go and every day make these preparations, and then every night we'd dose Dennis to see if anything happened, and nothing happened. It was very interesting because Terence was completely in his head. You know, he was the wittiest person I ever knew. And he, the Irish gift for the gab and a good yarn, and he would never let the truth or anything get in the way of a good story. He was a leprechaun in that sense, you know. I mean, he concocted this idea that religion was born of mushrooms, which is kind of nonsensical on the face of it, because religion was so obviously born of death. You know, death is the first mystery. It's the edge beyond which life ends and wonder begins, and how people deal with that inexorable separation defines their religious worldview. In fact, most religions, when stripped to the bone, are just attempts to wrestle with eternity and come out on top. So the idea that death would come from a mushroom, I would always argue it was quite the opposite. We had a desire to change consciousness that was innate in all cultures, and we went out and found ways to try to satisfy that. And those could involve the use of psychoactive plants, but also techniques of ecstasy, such as yoga, dancing, spinning, meditations, ordeal, etc. But Terence would never worry about. He loved to speculate in this kind of wild way. But he was also completely in his head and physically almost inept. He had no ability to walk in the forest. He would stumble, and he just had never been in the forest before, and it was kind of amusing. And he would prefer to sit in his hammock and kind of pontificate about mushrooms. And the irony is that we were in this Bora community where something quite interesting was happening, an annual dance ceremony, which is how, you know, these communities bring people together in good measure so that young men and women can find partners. And I remember we were staying in this old schoolhouse of a mission right below the Maloca. And the Maloca was just this incredible thing happening up there, where this community was responsible for the masks and the chicha, and the other community was responsible for bringing other food and mambe, or ipadu as it was called. And every night the drums would, signal drums would let each community know how much had been collected, how much. It was a kind of competition. It was ethnographically fascinating, but it had Terence wasn't interested at all in that. He wanted to take mushrooms and talk about Mars or something like that. And the irony is that the only reason the mushrooms were there is the cattle brought in by the missionaries, whose intention had been to destroy the culture of the people. And so I found it kind of silly. So I actually left the schoolhouse and slept in the Maloca with the Indians, with the Bora. But I enjoyed Terence enormously. And I remember after many, many nights when we would create these preparations by day and dose Dennis by night, and nothing would happen. And I remember I came upon Terence, and he had little vial of pure crystal DMT. And I wasn't the head of the expedition, but I was in a sense the leader, only in that I knew the culture and could speak Spanish, and none of them spoke Spanish. And I sort of said to Terence, I mean, what have you got that here for? I mean, bringing drugs to native cultures is not really the right thing to do. And but Terence said, "Oh, Wade, these shaman, they're always fucking with dosage. I just brought this shit along to let them know what kind of ballpark we're used to playing in." And another time I saw him just looking like a kind of wilted flower from the heat. And he wasn't using mambe, and which was strange to me. And I said, "Terence, are you okay?" He said, "I feel like a crystal of sugar on the tongue of a beast, impatiently awaiting dissolution." In other words, he was such a wonderful character. But, the thing is that Dennis ended up doing very serious science from that expedition and has continued to do extraordinary science since then. He has always honored his brother. But I think I would say that I sometimes think his brother, with his flamboyant and irresistible gift for the gab, has sometimes overshadowed Dennis, who I think in the end will be seen as having made a more significant contribution. And in memory of Terence, of course, Dennis has created the McKenna Academy, of which I'm a board member, and I support completely. And Dennis is very, very, very much carrying on the mission of the two remarkable brothers.
I think we as humans are lucky to have had them both, and how different they are. I'm just so sad that Terence died, so I can't ever interview him. But at least
the funny thing, once how you go to these conferences, Sam, and almost invariably panels are boring, right? You'll have a panel of 4 people, and the moderator simply goes to one person who gives a rap for 5 minutes, and the next person. Well, the one panel that was certainly not boring, many years ago, it was a panel where I was in between the two McKenna brothers. The panel was the 3 of us just having a conversation. And it was absolutely, to this day, I can still feel the kind of spiritual, psychic energy of those 2 amazing brains on either side of my head. It was a real joy.
Yeah. So you traveled to Amazon many times, and you said you had at least 20 ayahuasca or Yahé experiences. Does any of them stand out to you? Do you want to share any of them? And how do you think it affected you and in your journeys?
Well, I don't really separate ayahuasca from other entheogens or so on. I mean, one of the I think Ramdas and Leary were kind of archetypes, and Ramdas famously said, "Get the message and hang up." In other words, Ramdas was saying, take the psychedelic experience and learn from it, and see how you can incorporate that into your life through spiritual practice. Whereas Leary kind of got stuck in very much as John Lennon did, for that matter, for a time, whereas George Harrison kind of followed the advice, not literally, but effectively, of Ramdas and sought the spiritual path, having had that world opened to him by LSD. Lennon, almost to the point of self-immolation, continued to take acid trip after acid trip after acid trip. And the question becomes, how many times do you have to take the substance to learn what it has to teach you? I have no answer to that question, and I think every individual has their own answer to seek in that regard. In my case, I was more in the George Harrison camp, if you will. In other words, and it's to my good fortune in the sense that, our museum at Harvard was the world center for the study of psychoactive plants. So I was exposed to substances, and I suppose might have overused them if I hadn't had a different inclination or propensity. I tended to be not morally constrained in any way, but just so respectful that I was judicious in my use of these substances. I mean, I tried just about everything that was psychoactive and things that people didn't think were psychoactive. I mean, I found lots of new hallucinogens. You know, few people seem to know it, but Andrew Weil and I were the first people to publish scientifically on the use of the Sonoran toad, Bufo alvarius, in papers that came out in the early 1990s. We were very much on the lookout for these new substances before most people were even thinking about them. I mean, that was the work of the museum, if you will. And what I always say to people is that, you know, when we look back at the, however dark America may seem today, I've lived through incredible transformations. You know, you're too young, Sam, to remember how women were treated, how gay people were treated, how black people were treated. I'm too young really to remember. But in my lifetime, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom. People of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. When I was young, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was a great environmental victory. Nobody spoke about the biosphere or Gaia. Now these are terms that are familiar to school children, and all for the better. And yet, curiously, when we look at the ingredients in the recipe of social change that resulted in these really dramatic social transformations, cultural transformations, the one ingredient that until recently, with this renaissance, was consistently expunged from the record was the fact that millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having taken a psychedelic. Now, I say very, proudly, I wouldn't write the way I write. I wouldn't think the way I think. I wouldn't treat women the way I treat women. I wouldn't understand the nuances of the environment and nature and appreciate it as I do. I wouldn't certainly treat and understand homosexuality as I do had I not taken psychedelics. I remember my mother once said to me, as mothers did in that era, don't take these things, you'll never come back the same. And our poor parents didn't understand that that was the whole bloody point, was not coming back the same. So these substances were absolutely, in my mind, catalytic in my life and helped make me the person that I am. And I also, everybody, I think it's really important, because it's really important that no one who is interested in these substances feel any kind of peer pressure from anyone in any way, shape, or form. I found, for example, that when I was young and I wanted to deconstruct the world into which I was born that had been imposed upon me, first marijuana and later psychedelics were incredibly useful. And then as I came to a certain point in my life, when I was constructing my own world, building a career as an artist, as a writer, becoming a father, with all that implies, becoming, as the Vedic scriptures talk about, a householder with all the responsibilities of a householder. I didn't want that world blown apart, right? So while I may have occasionally dabbled in something so benign and sort of pleasant as MDA, I didn't really want the challenge that ayahuasca would invariably present, right? I mean, that's what ayahuasca is for. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's many things, but pleasant, as Tim said, is not one of them. When you speak with serious people like the Kofan, and my friend Randy Borman passed away, but he was chief of the Kofan in a very interesting situation. His parents had been missionaries, and as they had been trying to, in the 1960s, evangelize the Kofan evangelized their son, and Randy grew up completely Kofan. And when the Kofan speak of ayahuasca, it's seen. They use images like you're nursing at the breast of jaguar woman, and she tears you from her tit and throws you into a pit of vipers. I mean, that's what it's about. It's not supposed to be pleasant, right? It's this hell zone that you confront, you presumably grow from, and in time, if you persist, you break through. And I remember, for example, when I wrote the book One River in 1989 to 1996, I hadn't taken ayahuasca in 20 years. And I took it on several occasions just to remember what it had been like. And I remember one occasion just sort of clinging to my body for survival. It was so terrifying. And I've always been interested in the attraction that young people have to ayahuasca. Dennis and I have talked about that a lot. I mean, Dennis, in all seriousness, Dennis and Terence have always been drawn to the tryptamines, a class of compounds that really, if you take 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, you're not really even taking a hallucinogen because there's no one home anymore. It's like, I think Terence famously said it was like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. I mean, it basically eliminates self, and you find yourself in a kind of a universe of color and form and a dissociated state. And Terence and Dennis were always drawn to that state. That's why they were always interested in mushrooms, and they were always interested in Yahé and I've always been more drawn to indole. I've always found San Pedro cactus much more useful to me because it's physical. It grounds you in the earth. It's orgiastic in a way. It creates a connection to the natural world. I mean, if the tryptamines eliminate a sense of self and sort of put you in this, whether it's a real state or whether it's an imagined state or it's a sort of short circuit chemical explosion of your imagination, it basically eliminates self. The first time I smoked 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, which at the time was completely legal, I really thought I had died. And we tape recorded the sessions. And when I came out of the short-lived experience, tryptamines are very short-lived, my first words were, I felt like I was a bellows for God. And when they played the tape, the entire short experience, a single sound had been coming out of my voice like a mantra, and I was not aware of that at all. So it was kind of like, I find that tryptamines kind of like slap you around and then spit you out, and you kind of land and you have no kind of after effects, and you're kind of going, what was that, Whereas when I would take, as Terence always said, a heroic dose of San Pedro in Peru, in nature, on the coast or in the forest, I would have an 8-hour ecstatic, direct and memorable experience of the divine, of the glory of biological life. I remember being able to stare at a leaf of grass coming out of the desert sands of Peru for I don't know how long, but in complete awe of that achievement. And you come out of that experience not deranged, but inspired by just the pure fecundity and amazing nature of being alive. And also with San Pedro, you could have collective experiences. They always talked about collective experiences with Yahé, and the famous story of it being called, the drug beta-carbon be called telepathy. And at some point, I never had that experience with ayahuasca or Yahé. I always felt I was trying to spending most of my time clinging to survival when I took them. Whereas with there's a passage in One River that is absolutely true. When Tim and I had discovered a new species of Trichocereus, and I prepared what I thought was just a reasonable dose of it, but we had no idea it was a new hallucinogen. And it turns out we took an enormous dose of it. And we both experienced collective flight. And I had a vision of Tim like Icarus going to the sun and being destroyed. And of course, Tim would be destroyed. He died of AIDS, tragically. It was like the loss of my brother. That's when I was at the podium delivering the eulogy for Tim when I conceived the book One River in 1988 or 89.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this. There's so many topics you touched about ayahuasca, so if you let me, I will talk about those. But like with challenging ayahuasca experiences, and you also mentioned set and setting, and I think that you said that our generation come up with this new zeitgeist, a new way of seeing it. I think what we did, we added the third S to the setting. It's a skill. And so here at my retreat center, I've given ayahuasca now, not myself, I have an indigenous shaman, but we've given ayahuasca now to close to 3,000 people. And we have more than 700 5-star reviews. So everyone, like 99% of people leave very happy. So I think that missing ingredient of adding preparation, also like there's this long period of time before people even engage with ayahuasca, and there's a lot of workshops and word circles. They get very comfortable. And then also the dosage, it makes a very big difference. And the way I see ayahuasca as opposed to San Pedro, because I'm a big fan of San Pedro. I had a ceremony just last month. Is ayahuasca is like a surgery. It's this like difficult and pleasant experience where when you have a surgery, you don't really focus on the surgery itself. You focus on the outcome, because next day, or especially after doing a retreat, you feel so much better. But San Pedro, on the other hand, is this celebration where you just sit there and you're in nature and colors, like everything becomes so beautiful. And another thing I like that Dennis McKenna says is use of those plants as Gaian ambassadors, as in ayahuasca has adjusted and sort of like evolved, and other psychedelic traditions did the same, and they left the jungles and the forests and the mountains, and now they're coming into the society and sort of meeting us halfway and adjusting to what we want, because they try to get this message out, which is like, guys, like, look, you're destroying the world, like this is not good. And that's something that I see with thousands, like hundreds of people coming and saying like, well, I felt the pain the earth has experienced through ayahuasca. And that's a nice segue for us to talk about, which I know you're very passionate about, is protecting the jungle and protecting the world.
You know, Sam, that's a really, the first time anyone's actually explained it to me in a way that makes sense. You know, I love it the way Dennis talks about ayahuasca having agency and plants in general having agency, and you know, and I think with ayahuasca, when I really look back on it, almost every time I've taken it, and even for example, when I've taken it in ritual context, you know, very much in ritual with Martin von Hildebrand, or you know, in ceremony where we're present with the Badasana doing a remarkable ritual event. Yeah, it's always been sort of spontaneous. You don't know, you know, you're just being polite. You don't ask for the preparation. You wait until they offer it to you. They offer as much as they think you should have. It hasn't, you know, it's probably rare that I don't think I've ever been properly, in a sense, quote unquote, prepared for an ayahuasca ceremony, and the sense of the feeling the next day, which you mentioned, you know, you feel so good the next day. I mean, I always felt you felt so good because you were grateful to be alive, you know. But I think there is something going on where, I mean, I've got young friends in Bogota who will go to these sessions in a room above a taller, in the middle of busy Bogota, and 40 people, 40 strangers, all taking Yahé and reporting, as you report, these positive experiences. And I think I've never thought of it in terms of the metaphor of facing the darkness of our times, and yet, if you think about that, and think back to traditional use, a lot of what the shamanic use of Yahé seems to be about is the shaman facing darkness. There's always negativity, whether we define negativity as quote unquote deforestation or pollution or whatever, war or whatever. It's no different in essence than a Kofan shaman seeing the negative and dark forces of sorcery, for example, or in the case of the Warani, another group ready to attack you, in a society that had such high mortality due to intra-tribal warfare. So I can see how that metaphor is that's why you take ayahuasca, to come face to face and not avoid, but confront proudly, bravely, courageously, in a way that you somehow come out of the experience more prepared to confront darkness. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yes. So wait, we've already gone half an hour over the agreed time, and it's been, because I can probably do another 2 episodes with you. But let's
we can, Sam. But let me suggest something for all of you, wonderful people. Your generation, even younger. Something I've learned that I think is a real useful lesson. Like all young people, I was rabid. I was kind of a leftist revolutionary for a time. I was a zealot for one thing or another. And mercifully, I've sort of left all those indulgences behind. And one of the things that I have embraced is something my father said to me once. He said, my mother, for example, was not really a practicing Christian, but she was a Christian in her essence. And like all Christians, she had this sort of hope that if we just tried hard enough, good would eventually vanquish evil. That the Christ child would vanquish the fallen archangel, the devil. And my father, and that's the essence of the Christian dream. My father, who had been broken by the war, had no such illusions. But he used to say to me, son, there's good and evil in the world. Take your side and get on with it. And what he was saying is, don't ever expect to win. Light and darkness walk side by side, always will, always have. And you can't vanquish darkness. You can't vanquish evil, but you do have a choice. And that's what side are you going to serve? And when you adopt that attitude, it's very liberating. Because not only do you not expect to win, you don't get bothered if you lose. And you realize that the long walk of life is indeed a kind of pilgrim's path. And there is no destination. The destination is a state of mind. And so in my case, I've found that that's allowed me to remain deeply engaged, even as idealistic in a way, and certainly maintained the integrity of my beliefs and values in a positive sense into what is becoming older age, right? I'm 72, and I'm still as engaged. I still have as many hopes. I still rally to the side of what I see to be righteousness, whatever the issue is. I'm in this completely ridiculous, I suppose, quixotic quest to liberate a sacred plant, Coca. My friends, you say he doesn't even pay attention to the fact that he's up against the DEA, the U.S. government, the cartels, every nation state, every international organization, and he somehow thinks he's going to win. But I do think I'm going to win. and so I think that's a really useful image that, take your side and get on with it. And then you never get disappointed by losing, and it means you never give up the fight.
Thank you, Wade. Thank you for that wisdom, and I absolutely support your quest to liberate Coca. It's an amazing plant, and hopefully the world would stop being crazy and just accept that it's as great as it is. Any last words to the audience, and also where do you want them to find you, or what's should they read?
I think as a writer, I mean, it seems old-fashioned, but I love books, and I particularly for Colombian audience, Magdalena is a love letter to Colombia. One River, El Rio, is kind of a map of dreams for young Colombians who, for much of their lives, weren't able to travel in the country of their birth. Probably another book available in both Spanish and English would be The Wayfinders, which is sort of the manifesto of my work at National Geographic. But you can just go on to Amazon or Google, or go to my website, www.daviswade.com. Ridiculously out of date, but there's a lot of films pirated there, a few talks, and some of the books. All I'd say to you, is that I'd love to visit your retreat center and see everything you're doing, Sam. And I wish you well in your mission.
Thank you so much, Wade. We'll definitely make it happen, and maybe your friends can join as well. So, guys, thank you. You've been listening to Ayahuasca Podcast. As always, we do the host, Sam Believe, and I'll see you in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to support us and psychedelic renaissance at large, please follow us and leave us a like wherever it is you're listening. Share this episode with someone who will benefit from this information. Nothing in this podcast is intended as medical advice, and it is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This episode is sponsored by LaWayra Ayahuasca Retreat. At LaWayra, we combine affordability, accessibility, and authenticity. LaWayra, connect, heal, grow. Guys, I'm looking forward to hosting you.